So thank you so much, everyone, for taking the time to join us today, engage in this dialogue, in this learning exchange. As some of you may know, this is the third session in an 8-part series that is organized by MenEngage Alliance South Asia with the aim of exploring multiple angles with regard to youth-led advocacy. So as you may know, today's session, we're actually exploring more deeply into the topic of using storytelling as a tool for advocacy. And we have two individuals, Sharanya Sekaram and Benislos Thushan with us, who have had a lot of experience and insights to share as they have been in this field and have been dealing with this topic for a long time. So welcome Thushan and welcome Sharanya. And again, a warm welcome to all of you. So let me now hand it over to Inam. Inam is one of the youth committee members of MenEngage Alliance South Asia for some opening remarks.
Thank you, Renushi. A very good day to everyone who has joined us today, and welcome to the third session of the peer learning series organized by MenEngage Alliance titled Young People Can Transform South Asia Future. This peer learning series has been organized in close coordination with the MenEngage Alliance South Asia Youth Committee, which I too am part of. MenEngage Alliance is a global alliance working with men and boys for gender equality. And it's our belief that men and boys need to be part of solution as allies to women rights and other social justice movement. We use feminist approach with human right-based principles while promoting transformative, masculinity, which participants will learn as we go forward. Our advocacy efforts aim to promote the uptake of accountable, feminist, informed, human rights based, and gender transformative policies on engaging men and boys in human rights and gender justice for all. We strive to put women, girls, LGBTQI people, and most marginalized communities at the center of our advocacy efforts. For today's session, which is focused on the role of storytelling in youth-led advocacy in South Asia. To learn more about why human narratives are more compelling, and also an opportunity for you to learn how new tools and tips. Firstly, we have Sharanya Sekaram, who is a co-founder of Everstory Sri Lanka. And secondly, we have Benislos Thushan, who is a co-founder and chief digital strategist at Digital Storytelling. We want this to be a space for youth to voice their thoughts, share experience, and engage in cross-country, cross-regional, and intergenerational learning. Since youth deserve to have an active voice in decisions and that affect them, that being said, to be encourage all of you to engage with our speakers today and feel free to ask anything from them. With that being, I would like to hand over the day proceeding to Sharanya. And Sharanya, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction and for that important setting of the context of why we're here today. Good evening to most of you. I believe it is evening for most of you. It is an absolute honor and pleasure to be here and to speak with you all at this workshop. I have worked in policy and advocacy for over a decade, and particularly the use of storytelling has been such an interesting, what's the word I'm looking for? I think process, which is constantly evolving and shifting as we think about the tools that are available, but also how we think about and learn about how we engage with the world around us. I also want to acknowledge that it is also a pleasure to be doing this workshop with Benislos. We've collaborated before. We've been, what's the word, comrades in the field for a long time, starting from being youth activists to different places. So it's a real pleasure to be able to do this. And I guess that's kind of how we wanted to structure this workshop. I'm going to spend a short amount of time setting a little bit of context for how we want to approach this session. Then I'm going to hand over to Benny, who's going to do the same. Then I will come back and take you through a little bit of a broader idea of what the power of storytelling looks like when we're doing advocacy work. Why does it matter that we put such a heavy emphasis on storytelling? What does it mean when we're thinking about navigating, sharing stories to reach our advocacy goals? And then we'll hand back to Benny, who is really going to work on presenting practical tools and really build that practical skill set in how do you take understanding why we're using storytelling to actually using storytelling. So that's kind of how we've structured this session. I just want to say that a couple of things in the sense of setting a context. We want to be really clear that this is a safe space, which means we have to respect each other and we have to respect that all of us approach the ideas and what we see as a story in different ways. This also means that there's no such thing as stupid questions. At least I believe the only stupid questions are the questions that we don't ask. So please, even if you think a question is incredibly basic, to everyone, the question they need to know may feel basic, but there's no such thing as basic questions. So please feel free to ask us, even if you think it's very simple, it's likely that other people have the same question as well. So please do feel free to ask questions as much. And also find the joy in this, right? Storytelling can be such a joyful exercise, and it is such a phenomenal experience to uncover people's stories and understand how those stories can change the way people think, but not just change the way people think, and fundamentally change the way the world works and shifts and functions. And that's really important. And so that leads me to my sort of context setting, which is what we want you to think about is in this session is, what does a story communicate? When we think about telling a story, the question at the core of what we're asking ourselves is not telling a story for the sake of it, but what that story communicates. Is it communicating a data set that we want to push forward? Is it communicating an idea, a context, a history, a reality? That's the first question you always need to ask yourself when you're telling a story, is what is it that I'm trying to communicate with this story? Because all too often we've seen powerful, compelling narratives that have not had the impact that people hope it would have, because we don't understand or we haven't really thought about what we want to communicate with this story. That also helps you decide which stories in this context you want to select and tell. The second thing is, why do we use storytelling in advocacy? And we'll, this is a question we're going to keep returning back to throughout the session. But at the fundamental core of it, the question that really, or the simple answer for that is that storytelling is something human beings and communities have done since the beginning and the dawn of time. From cave drawings to oral histories, we have always used stories as a way to preserve our cultures, as a way to share our experiences, and also as a way to communicate different ideas and ways of being. Sometimes when we reflect on our cultures, especially in South Asia, we don't often recognize storytelling for what it is. For example, mythology is such a powerful form of storytelling that has communicated not only religious ideas in many cases, but also morals, traditions, values, why things are the way they are, right? And especially in South Asian communities, storytelling has always held such a pride of place in how we connect with each other, in how we describe our contexts, There's hardly a South Asian who doesn't have at least 2 or 3 stories in their arsenal that's unique to their country or their culture or their community. You have from the stories that center Gandhiji in India, that are used as a variety of ways to communicate morals and traditional values. If you go across to Afghanistan, you have the famed Mullah Nasruddin stories, which are used as jokes, but a way for Afghans to connect with each other from different provinces. If you come across to Sri Lanka, you have the Buddhist tradition of the Jataka Kathavas, the Buddhist stories, which communicate different ideas of goodness and behavior and moral conduct in society. And these are just 2 or 3 examples of these traditions. So as South Asians, it is important that we don't only take a Western lens of looking at what storytelling is from a INGO, so to speak, perspective of storytelling. It's also important that we find ways to weave our traditional histories and our traditional ways of storytelling to connect with the communities that we engage with, are a part of, and work with. And that is the power of storytelling for advocacy, is that there is no culture in the world that doesn't have some form of storytelling or some practice of this, that then allows us to connect with these communities in the way that they recognize, and then really bring out what it is we want to advocate for and work towards the goals that we are looking to advocate for. So that's the context, the larger context in which we want you to start thinking about what it means for storytelling, and the power of storytelling within advocacy. I'm now going to hand over to Benny, who's going to talk a little bit about his side of the context setting and the purpose and goals of the session today. Benny, over to
you. Thank you so much, Sharanya, and thank you so much for MenEngage Alliance for having us today, especially to talk about something I'm deeply, deeply passionate about. And also I share a lot of pride in involving with a lot of great people such as Sharanya in doing this line of work, because sometimes these kind of interventions would be thought as playful or not too important, right? And okay, what's so big deal about storytelling, right? But then again, these I would call them, sometimes it's very soft interventions, but they have the absolute power to change the hearts, change the attitudes, and change the trajectory of the community. So thank you for having us here today. So Sharanya has very well told you about how to approach this session, right? And I just want to reiterate one thing. As Sharanya told, please feel free to ask questions, right? Just and one thing I would also say is, especially when I am presenting later, like you can just unmute yourselves and ask while I am presenting, right? Or you can just the chat box, whatever that you feel comfortable at, right? And neither Sharanya nor I am here to judge you or give you credits for how brilliant the question is or how informed it is. It is just to have a healthy dialogue, and also to agree to know that we might come with different level of expertise, and we can definitely share with each other the knowledge, the experiences, what we already have, right? So ask questions and also engage as much as you can, right? Because you have, like, one thing that's so incredible about doing a storytelling workshop or storytelling training or even a session about storytelling is the fact that there is no expert in this, right? Maybe we might have a little bit of an edge because we've been doing this line of work so that we are informed a little bit more because the work requires us to be. But all of us are living, breathing storytellers in one form or the other. And there's so much more for all of us to learn from each other, right? And when I go into a workshop, when I go into especially like working with youth, right? And something that incredibly excites me, inspires me, and also always humbles me, is that there might be like a better storyteller who sometimes they might not even attribute the word of storytelling, but they would be very natural at it. right? You'll be extremely good at telling the story of your community, right? So I would want to just start with one thought, right? Um, and I would also want all of you to think about this because Sharanya has told, right? Always come back to this question of why storytelling, right? And what does storytelling represent for me on a personal level? Right, I've been doing this line of work with the Digital Storytelling Initiative for the past 7 years, right? Working with young people, with journalists, with professionals from different spectra, right? I think one of the incredible power of storytelling is that, like, it helps you to reclaim your own narrative. It gives you the agency to tell the world, okay, this is who I am. This is what my community is. These are the set of values I abide by. And this is how I want to be seen. Right? For me, that is one of the most incredible power of storytelling, right? Because if you really go back to 40 years of time, the humanity didn't have that power, right? It has always been people who were thought to be above us, who decided, okay, what we should see, what we should hear, and how communities should be defined, right? What are the values that should be attributed to the communities? And the incredible power of storytelling is we can just break it and say, no, I do not really agree with it, right? This is how I want to be seen, right? And I don't want to hand over my agency to anyone, say it a mainstream media institution, right? Because one of the very reasons that really propelled me to start this was, like, Sri Lanka, as most of you know, had the second largest civil conflict, like second longest civil conflict in the world, right? And one of the heartbreaking truths is that although the war is over, hardly we address the root causes of it. And one of the very prominent root causes of this war is the politicized mainstream media. And for far too long, they have divided the communities, right? They have a set of agendas, set of narratives, and they would keep attributing that narratives to the communities. And Sri Lanka being geographically scattered and divided, especially along the ethnic, religious, and lingual lines, it is extremely, extremely difficult for people to understand each other's perspective. And the mainstream media have profited out of it, and also was very successful in aiding and abetting the politicians who wanted to still keep dividing the country, right? My intention is not to walk you through the Sri Lankan history, right? But what storytelling really gives the power is it gives the power to the communities and say, we do not want to be defined by your narrative. We do not want to be seen the way you want us to be seen, right? Say, I am someone who comes from the north of Sri Lanka with a particular set of experiences, and I get to define what my experiences are. And I'll tell you a few examples as we look into the practical sessions. But boy, like when you start reclaiming the narratives, the amount of people you start to, I don't know whether I'm allowed to use this word, piss off or start to anger when you do that, it shows that it is really working. Say the diaspora community, say it is the politicians, also it is those who have used to holding that power within your social spectrum. So I would invite you, all of you, to really actively participate. We want to hear from you. We want to hear your experiences, and also to think. We do not want this to be yet another Zoom session where you attend for 1.5 hours and go back to your old ways, right? What we want this is, even if you learn one or two things, and if you would take it back and apply it and start seeing through that lens, not because we told, but it makes sense for you to do that, then that would be real successful lesson. So we invite all of you to actively participate, engage with us, talk to us, share your experiences, and in that way, we all of us can inform each other. So thank you, and really looking forward to engaging with you. Sharanya, over to you.
Thanks so much, Benny. Before I get started into the actual portion of my section, which is the power of storytelling, I want to address a question that's already come up in the chat. Thank you so much for asking that. which is the question around culture and how culture is often an obstacle for women and girls to excel. And how do you make a narrative story in these strict patriarchal norms? That's such a powerful question, because I absolutely agree. One of the questions you have to ask when you look at traditional stories is who is telling this story, who benefits the story, and whose narratives are centered in this story. And I think one of the ways to start doing that is to question also, as part of storytelling, the stories we have been told. For example, in India, emerging now among feminist writers, is a very interesting tradition or an interesting exercise of taking traditional mythological stories, but retelling them from the point of view of the women involved. For example, there's a fantastic book called The Palace of Illusions, which retells the story of the Mahabharata from the point of view of Draupadi, which is one of the main female characters. And it had such a powerful impact, and it continues to be such a powerful piece of literature, because now you have more and more feminist writers who are taking famous tales like Rama Sita, or the story of Kannagi, and retelling these stories from the point of view of the women. And I think that's the first thing to ask yourself, right? Is that take the traditional stories, of course, which tell us so much, but also when you are telling your own stories, consistently question who is telling the story, whose point of view from which are these stories being told? And is there a way to take stories we have always been told and question them, and recenter different characters in those stories to ask questions of, well, how did this person feel about it? And I think that's a fantastic way to start, because it is a very subtle hijacking of patriarchal traditions of storytelling by recentering the character within them. And also, that's the beauty of storytelling, as Benny said, is that anyone can be a storyteller. How do you make and tell a story? You tell a story. You tell a story in the way that you feel compelled to tell that story. And with women and girls, we'll get into some examples. It is those stories, the tellings of their own stories, that have fundamentally shifted the world, because they are speaking in their own voice and pushing aside assumed notions of how we think the world works so much. Thank you very much for that question. I think that's such a phenomenal and important question. So to begin this section, we're going to run a small group exercise. I'm putting a link into the chat. And you'll find that when you go into that link, there's a space for you to put in several words, and you can do it over and over again if you want, with a fairly simple question: is what should a good story communicate? And this is something I want to put to all of you. And we'll wait a few minutes and you can start putting your answers, and we'll see the answers as they come up on the screen. But the key question here is, what I want you to think about is just for you to put in words of what you think a good story, what are the elements of a good story that you think that should be communicated? Is it certain kinds of emotion? Is it a structure? Is it a beginning and an end? What is it you think a good story should communicate? And we'll wait a couple of minutes for answers to come in and then have a conversation about it. Okay, let's start talking. Please keep putting in your answers, but let's start talking about some of the things we see. Perspective is an incredibly important one, absolutely. It needs to be very clear from whose perspective this story is being told. And you can also tell the same story again from different perspectives, right? Don't shy away from that. Emotion and feelings are incredibly important, so are experiences. But I want to bring something to the fore. I see a lot of words and phrases that talk about pain points, struggles, overcoming challenges, empathy. And that is incredibly important. It is a big part of storytelling for advocacy is to communicate the challenges and the experiences and the difficulties that people exist. But please don't forget to also center joy in storytelling. One of the most wonderful things that storytelling can bring for advocacy is that it can also share joy in spaces where sometimes joy feels difficult to find. And that is really important, because joy, pleasure, hope, and laughter are what is the world we're advocating for at the end of the day. No matter how you look at what our advocacy goals are, at the end, that's what we're looking to do, right? We're trying to build a world in which hope, joy, laughter thrive freely and they thrive openly. And storytelling, it's also as much as it is important for us to document our struggles, and as much as it is important for us to document our pain and our difficulty, we must not forget to also document our joy, our laughter, and our happiness, because that makes a huge difference as well. I really like the answer on a true picture of society, those who are saying about a lived experience, context, because these are also all incredibly important. Context is such a good point because it's really important to set your story or what you're trying to communicate, to understand why it is that this is what we're trying to communicate and why it's important to understand that. It should absolutely be thought-provoking. Now, here's where the key thing comes in, right? There are no wrong answers in any of what you've said. A good story should have this and more. But not every good story needs to have all of these things. That is what a good story should communicate. You need to select what your story is going to communicate, and that is a powerful story. The power of storytelling is the ability to take very specific instances, situations, and contexts and communicate them in a compelling way that draws in other people and causes empathy. I think empathy is one of the most key words that has been put up here, because a good story is able to create empathy. It's able to make people feel like they could be in that situation and thus bring them closer to the issue that you are trying to communicate. Great, thank you so much for these answers. And I will share this slide with the answers, because that's the first thing we want you to start doing, right? Is to start really thinking about what is it that you want to communicate with these stories. And a good story, what it does is it's clear about what it communicates. These are things it can communicate, but a good story communicates clearly the goals of what it is you want to have translated through this story. Just give me 1 minute. I'm going to share my screen and we can look at a few slides that I've put together to help guide the conversation. Okay, here we go. So what is the power of storytelling? We often hear this phrase thrown around. We know, oh, tell your stories matter. But what does that really mean? How have stories and storytelling really, especially when we think about advocacy and policy, how has it really shifted and changed anything, really? Has it actually done that? Powerful stories that have had an impact. These are the questions we need to ask ourselves. When we look at the history of powerful stories within the advocacy space that have worked and have had an impact, the questions we need to ask ourselves is, what is the idea? How do we bring these ideas to life? Because often at the core of a powerful story is an idea one is trying to communicate. It could be about, like I said, about a data set. It could be about a certain kind of world you're trying to create. It could be about a specific challenge or a specific experience people are having. It could be about a context or a moment in history or a time period that exists. The question about the story is, how do you then bring this idea to life? How do you make it real beyond the numbers, the statistics, the facts, and the figures? The second thing is, do they work? And I would argue that, and of course, we believe very much in the power of it, and it does work because it humanizes these experiences. It makes them easily digestible, and it also makes them more real. A series of numbers on the page means something, absolutely, but a series of numbers on the page accompanied by compelling human narratives are so powerful because it brings it to life and it makes it a real living, breathing thing. What have they been able to change or inspire is a question we need to look at when we think about the stories that have had an impact. What is it? It may not always be an apparent change or an evident change or even a very specifically tangible change, but the question we need to ask is, how or what are we changing or inspiring by telling this particular story or using this particular story? And then we also need to ask ourselves, what do we learn from these stories? How they are presented, how they were collected, how they were told, Now, this is particularly important, right? Because often when we talk about stories, we talk about the story itself, we talk about the content of the story, what the story communicates, what it changes. We don't often also stop to reflect of how that story was collected. Because remember, at the core of every story is a person. You're taking someone's story and there's a person. So how did we collect this story? And how did we actually tell this story? Did we honor the person at the center of it? Did we consider their consent, their safety, their experience, or did we use their story to further an agenda we may have had? But is that always fair, just, or right? And that's a really important element that I also want to make sure that we think about today, is how do we tell certain stories also? And are they always fair in the way that we tell them? So to this end, I've picked out 3 examples of global stories. 2 are rooted in the region. One is potentially a well-known story in the more global arena. All 3 are probably stories you've heard before or come across them in some form or another, to help us think about some of these questions a little bit more deeply. The first is the story of Malala Yousafzai and the question of girls' education. I'm sure Malala's story is no secret to anyone at all in the room, but can someone give us a quick brief on who Malala is and what was the story, what was her story? If you can unmute your mic and ask. Yeah, a girl hero who raised voice for girls' education during the Taliban time in the Swat Valley. Any other details that seem important to this?
Hello, ma'am. This is Siddharth Khan from KP, Pakistan, District Bunair.
Yeah.
The incident that was happened during the time of Taliban at the Malakand division, Malala was suffered a lot during like that oppression. As she was a young girl, she was she was very talented. She had potential to encourage the girls particularly, because the ratio and the percentage of education in Malakand division is, if I say negligible, so I would not be incorrect. So at that time, she was going to school, and on the way, she was tortured. An incident came to her, and some of the human in the clothes of, like the animals in the clothes of human, they attacked on an innocent girl, and she was injured. Her body was injured due to the bullets which were entered to her body. But later on, she didn't stop her struggle. Like in such, we can say, in such a chaotic condition, but she did a lot of things for the students, particularly for the female education around the world, not just particularly limited to District Bunair or to Pakistan or to the KP province. She did a lot.
Thank you. Thank you so very much. I think that was a wonderful way to explain the power of what Malala's story was able to inspire, not like you said, not just in Pakistan, not just in one district, but across the world, right? And as you rightfully said, Malala Yousafzai's story is probably one of the best known in the world in terms of understanding the oppression towards girls and their education in particular parts of the world. As you said rightfully, she was a schoolgirl who was shot by the Taliban on her way returning back from an exam in 2012. And she was repatriated to the UK, to the United Kingdom, and became an icon and a champion for girls' education, which she had already been. Conducting activism at the local level before this attack came. Now, Malala's story is a fantastic example of how one story becomes an idea and becomes a wave of change for people to understand an issue they may not have taken very seriously before this. Before the attack on Malala, which became a global viewpoint, there were lots of people and there was a lagging interest in the idea of girls' education. Because remember, we were situated in 2012. We were not situated in the 80s or the 70s or the 60s we were situated in what felt like a modern time period. People believed at that time that a lot of things with the internet and with what was going on, that it wasn't possible anymore for women and girls to be oppressed in the way they had been. They believed with the liberation of Afghanistan or what was believed to be the liberation of Afghanistan with the US having entered it in 2001, with the belief that the world had changed, that nobody was really attacking, and nobody was going to attack young girls. They may attack soldiers, they may attack adult women for simply going to school. So what happened when the attack on Malala happened, it brought to life, and the telling of her story brought to life, because it humanized what was a vague idea of something that was happening all the way over in Pakistan that had no impact, no reality for girls around the world. It made people wake up and realize, and the power of her story was that it made people realize this could be my child, this could be me. Because Malala had no difference. She was also simply a schoolgirl seeking to get an education who had dreams. She was like any other girl anywhere in the world who was attacked and could have potentially died simply for wanting to go to school and get an education. And it humanized the narrative. It stopped being a vague thing that was happening all the way across the world. It gave a face, and it was one face that people realized that were also many other faces that existed that we didn't know about. And it also brought to fore the reality that while the world had changed dramatically in the last few decades, it hadn't changed enough. And that just because great strides had been made in girls' education in different parts of the world, it didn't mean that in every part of the world it was the same, and that we could take our foot off the pedal, right? And so that is what I want you to think about when you think about Malala's story, is how do you take one narrative, but how do you go beyond the narrative? And that's what Malala's story was able to do, right? It was able to take the story of Malala, the story of a girl who was attacked because she wanted an education, and push it beyond to say, how do we then impact education for anybody who wants it beyond this one person? How do you take the story and what it represents, but don't limit it to an individual narrative, but rather use it as a representation of a larger, wider issue? And that's really important, because sometimes when we tell a singular story, it's sometimes easy to get caught up in the singularity of the story and to get caught up in the individual there. But in Malala's case, it was such a successful example of storytelling for advocacy, because they use the individual, they use the single story to show it as an example of a wider, larger, greater issue, and inspire change and support and advocacy around that issue, right? A fund has been created, the Malala Fund exists. She's continually used as a reminder and example of the need to advocate for girls' education, what it means when you give girls an education. So the story is Malala's story, but it is simply a representative of many other stories. And she does that beautifully, right? When you listen to her speak, she keeps saying how she was lucky and she is not the only one. So that's very important. That's the lesson I want you to take away when we think about Malala's story and the power of storytelling, is often we have to tell a single story because we can't tell all of the stories, but don't get caught up in the individual. The question you have to say is, when I'm telling this individual story or using this individual story, what does it represent? And when you watch when Malala speaks, that's how she's used her story. She said, I am just one person, but there are hundreds and thousands of girls who will be dealt the same fate and who deal with the same fate as I did consistently for wanting to go to school. So you looked at Malala, but you were reminded of that it's not just Malala, that giving Malala the education alone wasn't enough, that it was about many, many girls like Malala. And that's important, to not get caught up in the individual aspect, but to understand what the individual represents. All right, the next compelling story for advocacy that I wanted to share with you is probably one that those of us who are in our, I want to say 20s and 30s now, remember, because it was one of the first campaigns in a Western country that we really watched play out on social media, firstly, because this was in 2008, President Barack Obama's first presidential bid. And the and the wave of change and interest that it inspired across the world was really fascinating. Everybody now remembers Yes We Can, which became the rallying cry for this campaign. But what I want you to really think about when we think about the story of Barack Obama, the story of him being the first African-American person of African-American descent to become head of state in the United States, to become president, what it meant for someone who looked like him, who had his upbringing, coming from, a single mother, being disconnected from his father, being Black, all of these things. It's about the idea that it inspired. So when the Obama campaign put out his story, again, it was about Obama the individual, but it was also about what Obama the individual represented. They talked about how Obama represented the change that we could see, and it was a tangible representation of potential change. They also really focused on history in the making. They said, if you come out and vote, and if you vote for Obama, you are voting for the first Black president in this country. You are voting for history. You're voting to make history happen. And that is a very powerful narrative that storytelling is able to inspire in terms of advocacy. What the Obama campaign did was include in their campaign a powerful call to action. And we'll talk about a call to action a bit more. But a good story and a powerful story for advocacy doesn't just begin and end with a story. It always embeds into it a call to action. It says, okay, look at this story, listen to this story, and this is what you should be doing. Go out and do this thing, because that's what will get our goal forward. And in the case of the Obama campaign, they told people, if you go out and vote and donate and campaign, then you will get to be a part of history. So later you can look back on your life and say, I was a part of this, and that was history that was made that day. It is something that will be printed in textbooks, that will be remembered across the world. And they were right? The first African-American president was a historical moment for the country, for a country where a few centuries ago, African-Americans were slaves, to go to holding the highest position in the land, however you feel about the politics of it. The point was that the campaign was able to drive that idea of creating history, and people, by acting and working with the campaign in whatever way, whether it was by donating or voting or posting, that they were involved in creating history. And you'll notice that element, that call for action element, is very strong now. And it's something a lot of other political campaigns and other campaigns use at the core of their campaign. The Trump campaign used a very similar thing, right? They said that their campaign was Make America Great Again, which also involved a call to action. It was again saying, by getting involved, you can create this. It pulled that call to action. And that is the power of storytelling, right? Is that it inspires people to take an action that you are asking them to take by giving them a vision of what can happen if they take this action, right? It drives that inspiration and that drive to want to act, because by acting, you are then saying this can't possibly happen. And that's a very powerful, important moment. And that was the core message, or what I want you to think about when you think of the Obama story and the campaign of the Obama presidential bid, right? At the core, what they had was a powerful call to action that made people feel connected and made people feel involved. And that is really vital when you tell a story, is that when you tell the story, the people have to feel like, okay, so what? I know this story, so what? Now, how does that story inspire me to go on to take action, to go on and take action in a way that pushes forward the advocacy goals that we're pushing for. The third example that I wanted to share with you all is one that is more of a tale of caution and a tale of what perhaps we need to be more critical of when we think about the stories that we tell, than as inspirational perhaps as the other two were. Some of you may not remember this particular story, which occasionally comes to the fore in different ways. It is called, it is a photographic portrait of a woman named Shabat Kula, who it's known as the portrait of an Afghan girl, and it was taken in 1984 by a photojournalist named Steve McCurry. And it appeared in 1985 on the cover of National Geographic magazine. It's potentially one of the best known photographs in the world and has become sort of emblematic of this idea of a refugee or a refugee girl or woman located in some distant camp, which should, inspire our empathy and our passion and our compassion. Now, for a long time, nobody even knew the name of the girl who was photographed in the picture. And it was only, the picture was taken in the 1980s. It was only in 2002 that she was identified. And she was a child of Pashtun origin who was living in a refugee camp in Pakistan during the time that the Soviets had occupied Afghanistan. She was 12 when she was photographed. And in fact, when she was tracked down, and she was a much, much older woman when she was tracked down, she described to the interviewer in 2002 that she was really upset with the photograph that was taken because it was published without her consent. She talked about how when McCurry came to her refugee camp, she normally wears a burqa, and she was really, really hesitant to meet him because he was a male from outside of her family. This photograph was published, and people said, oh, you have to look at this. Her eyes are so compelling. It's the eyes and pain of a woman who's trapped in a refugee camp. And what Gula actually said was that the pain in her eyes was that she was forced to be photographed by a strange man she didn't know, looking at a camera. And in fact, she's only been photographed 3 times in her life. At that point, this was the first time anyone had taken a photograph of her. Now, like I said, this is more of I use this example to say that, yes, this was a powerful story that was supposed to inspire compassion in the Western world for what these, poor Afghan refugees were going through. But I want you to remember that when we tell stories, we also have a responsibility. The first responsibility is that we have to have the consent of the person whose story we are telling. Remember that at every story that we take and tell and use for advocacy, you cannot violate someone's consent for the greater good. And we see this all the time in the advocacy world. We see people's personal, private, painful stories being shared with their names attached. We see stories of women and their sexual exploitation, the violence they have faced. They're used as vehicles to promote our advocacy. But just because we believe we're doing something good by promoting an issue doesn't take away the pain and the reality that we did not get consent from the person whose human story this is. That's the first thing. If the person who has shared their story with you, shared this deep, vulnerable moment with you, have not given you consent or is not aware of what you are using this story for, then you should not be using it. Because we cannot compromise human beings, their dignity and their rights, just because we believe we're doing it for a good cause. Just because you believe you're doing it for a good cause, you're not selling it, you're trying to put forward an issue, doesn't make it okay. And as storytellers and those who work in advocacy, we have to be more critical, because so often people's dignity and their stories and their pain are sacrificed and used and exploited because we believe we're doing it for the greater good. And that's really important. The second thing is that it's really important that we tell these stories authentically as they have been told to us, especially when we're telling someone else's story, and not re-manipulate the story to fit our narratives. Benny talked about how in Sri Lanka we have a very politically partisan media, and how this happens all the time when they drive narratives. And we see this all the time in the media, right? They lift up certain narratives, leaving out parts of it that don't fit the agenda that they're trying to fit. We don't hear the whole truth. Very often we do it ourselves, right? Is that we hear a story and we lift up only certain parts. Now, I'm not saying you have to tell the whole story with all of its context. No, that's difficult. I'm not disagreeing. What I'm saying is when we tell stories, it is important to ask the questions of, am I centering the person and their authentic truth in this story? Even if it doesn't align with what I want to tell, even if it makes me uncomfortable. And even if it's not the story I expected to uncover, is the person at the center of the story telling their truth, and are we honoring that truth in the way that they want it to be honored? Because with this portrait, that grew an impression that these women were battered, backward, afraid, oppressed, which they are to some degree, but it was also from a Western lens. They are not more battered and oppressed and tortured than women in the Western world. There's also a lot of the problems we talk about in South Asia, whether it be child marriage or lack of education, all of these things also happen in the Western world, right? And we just tend to shrink ourselves down thinking that's what is wanted. People talked about her compelling eyes, but nobody thought about the person who was forced to stare at a strange white man she had never met before and have her photograph splashed across the world, and she didn't even know about it. So please remember that behind the stories you tell, there are human beings, there are people. If you don't have their consent and you're not centering who they are, even if it's not the story that you agree with or you want to tell, we're not honoring what needs to be honored. And that's very, very important. All right, so what are the key essentialing when we're using it for advocacy? It's important that you use language that is simple. You don't need to create overly flowy language. You don't need to create 100 details. Make sure that it's simple, it's accessible, and that simple language is often the most effective communicator. It doesn't need to be repetitive details. It doesn't need to be every single detail you can think of. Sometimes simple and clean is the best approach. It's important that you have a force of empathy. Why are you telling this story? What are you asking people to identify with in this story that is pushing forward the advocacy goal that you're looking to put forward? It's really important the stories are backed with data, right? So that we don't get caught up in the individual. If you're telling the story of girls' education, if you're telling the story of sexual and reproductive health, of rights, it's important that you say, this is a story, here is the reality for so many people, and then here is the data that helps us understand the reality of the story. And of course, it's really, really important that you include a call to action. People need to hear this story and feel compelled to act, whether it's by donating to something, whether it's by sharing something, whether it's by asking a question, whether it's by involving themselves in some way. People need to hear that story, and you have to tell them, here's how you act. I want to address the question that's been asked in the chat, which is, does the story have to have a positive impact? Did Obama make a positive impact globally? Yes, so when I say positive impact, I don't necessarily mean that the story has to be positive for us to have an impact. What I mean is that it has to have an impact that potentially could be positive. So for example, the Malala story is not exactly a positive story. It's a story of fear and pain and difficulty and challenges, but the impact that it had is positive. Now, not every story we tell is going to have a positive impact. Some may have a negative impact, but just to be clear is that we're specifically in this workshop talking about using storytelling for advocacy. So when we are trying to use storytelling in terms of advocacy, specifically for that purpose, it's important that we think about the impact that this story can have, and it should be a positive impact, right? Because a positive impact is what drives our advocacy goals forward, in the sense that that's what we mean by positive. In the question of, did the Obama story make a positive impact globally? That's really a debatable question. There is very little, you can make the argument both ways, but I included it because it was a story that even today, people may not remember every US president and their story, but the Obama story will always be remembered. And it did. It had a positive impact in the sense that many people in many countries drew inspiration from it. It also put forward the idea that a community can start from nothing and build itself up to something else. It also made the impact that it showed people how history does evolve and history does change and evolve. And that is a very positive impact, because it caused a lot of communities to start looking at their own histories and say, what has changed and how far have we come? Because often we look at how far we have to go, but we don't take the moment to think about how far we have come. It's also important for us to understand who our audience is. That's an important question we need to ask, right? Who is our audience? Who are you targeting this at? Because that is how you tailor your story to really, really draw in the people you wanted to draw. Are you addressing this to donors? Are you addressing this to potential funders? Are you addressing change makers, policymakers, political leaders? Are you addressing parents? Are you addressing adults? Are you addressing children? Who is the audience that you're addressing? And so that'll craft the call to action, what elements of the story you draw out to bring empathy. So for example, if you take the story of Malala, you would use different versions of the Malala story depending on the audience. If you were telling the story to children, you would use much more simple language, but you would also talk to them about standing by what you believe no matter what, and that you can make a change no matter how young you are. If you were addressing it to parents, you would talk about supporting your children, and you would change that. So just very quickly, I'm going to wrap up in a second, but I just wanted to say that there are a number of methodologies you can use in storytelling. There's theater, there's the visual arts, spoken narratives, documentaries, and still images and photo stories. But finally, I want to end by saying that here are the stories that we tell. We have to ask ourselves, what are the stories we tell? Why do we tell those stories? And how do we use the power of the story? That's really important. So I'm happy to take questions at the end, but I'm going to hand over to Benny, who is going to do the tools section of it. Benny, over to you.
Thank you very much, Sharanya. I hope all of you got a very comprehensive understanding, especially about what does storytelling really mean, right? And how to navigate the complex landscapes, right? And why consent is important. So I want to ask a simple question to start with, right? So in your perspectives, right, I want you to just think about, and I'll give a chance for two people, if you could unmute yourselves and say, right? In your perspective, in your community, like especially after listening to the story of Malala, listening to the story of Barack Obama, right? And also listening to how you should structure a story, right? Just reflect on all that you have absorbed until now and tell me, what does storytelling mean to you? Right? I know it might sound like a little bit complex question, but I really want you to think hard a little bit and tell me, like, what does storytelling mean to you? Right? And it can be subjective for different people, right? For me, what storytelling really embodies is a phenomenal opportunity to reclaim your narrative, right? As I told already, and to showcase it to the world and say, hey, this is how, also to say, this is how I want to be seen. And also this is to say, this is how I see the world, right? So usually when we start the workshops, right, we do a very interesting activity. We ask them to, we give them like a piece or like a sheet of paper. We ask them to storyboard one of the most memorable experiences of your life, right? When we start, like an icebreaker session, when we start a session, to introduce themselves with a story, right? And one of the very powerful, because we have limited time, I'm not going to do it here, but one of the powerful outcome that comes out of it is, right, you bring 30 strangers from completely different settings, right, from completely different backgrounds, so who do not know each other necessarily in any ways. But when you do that activity, right, maybe at the end of that activity, they wouldn't know their names or where they come from, but they would end up knowing the story what they have heard from them, like from each of them, right? Sometimes I tell this example. We might not remember what we learned in the classroom yesterday, right? We might struggle to put it into words, so to understand how it, like what it meant. But sometimes we remember a story we might have heard 5 years ago. Or we might remember a movie we might have watched 10 years ago. or we would remember a photograph we might have seen 15 years ago, right? And there comes the question why, right? Why aren't we able to remember something that was told yesterday, right? But in the meantime, why we are able to remember something in the span of so much time, even in 10 years, 15 years, right? What is the reason? What is the secret source that stays with us, right? That determines what becomes a successful storytelling and what doesn't, right? So I'm going to quickly screen share and run you through it. I hope you can share this, see the screen. So this is one of my favorite quote, right? This quote says, storytelling is the most powerful way to put ideas into the world today, right? Storytelling is the most powerful way to put ideas into the world today. We are going to see why, but I truly believe it, right? And all of a sudden we can see the aspect of storytelling has become such a hot buzzing term, right? Development sector uses it. INGOs uses it, right? Which is also part of the development sector. Politicians use storytelling in their speeches, right? Or even in the policies they present, right? One of the really good example which Sharanya suggested is how President Barack Obama has been extremely successful in using the personal anecdotes and stories in presenting different policies to the people, right? For example, when they introduced the free healthcare for all, which is also Affordable Care Act, which was known as Obamacare, right? They did not argue the merits of the policy, like how many billions, how many million, none of it was argued, right? They simply brought in those who are already ill. They simply asked them to tell their story, and they simply asked the question, what could free health insurance mean to you, right? And that was one of the most powerful tool they used to tell the story, right? Hey, look, I don't have the health insurance. As a result, I might not be able to afford this particular surgery. As a result, my lifespan could potentially become very small and I could die anytime. But having such a health insurance would help me live a longer life, right? And it was really fascinating to see the word cloud some of you have suggested, right? For me, one of the most powerful element of a good story is that it has the aspect of empathy, right? So as I told you earlier, right, why some of the stories stick with us even after 10, 15, 20 years? What is the secret sauce to it? Is the emotional connection we develop with the story, right? As I tell it, right? If I could ask you a question, what is your favorite movie? Or even the question of what is your favorite movie scene, right? You can viscerally remember how that particular scene makes you feel, right? If you ask me, like personally, I have some of these scenes which I go back to, and I still can very well remember how it makes me feel, right? So how do we craft stories that has empathy, that can make an emotional connect with your audience, right? So as this quote says, storytelling is the most powerful way to put ideas into the world today, right? So what really is storytelling? I quickly want to show you a quick video, right? As we look at it, just a quick video, and I'll come back to the session. This is one of my favorite example I usually like to show, right? How brands embrace storytelling, right? How evil some of the corporates are, but it speaks to the larger point about the relevance of storytelling and why we should also exploit this huge potential, right? I hope the sound is clear. I'll quickly play it and I'll come back to it.
My name is Kate. It has always been my dream to become a champion, but that can be hard with type 1 diabetes. It was just so many shots and finger pricks every single day. I went from having to check my blood sugar manually every 20 minutes to now all I have to do is just glance down at my wrist, which reads the insulin pack attached to my side. I feel like I don't have type 1 when I'm competing now.
High school record. That's unbelievable.
My name is YJ. Back in February of 2019, I was diagnosed with high blood pressure and hypertension. The medications cost me $2,000 a month with insurance. That was the tipping point for me. I started tracking my exercises and started tracking my health all through my watch. Almost 18 months later, I am not on any medications and I am in the best shape of my life.
My name is James. We were sitting in the living room and I glanced down at my watch because it kind of vibrated. It flashed increased heart rate. About time we got to the hospital, my heart rate was 206. And she said, "Sir, you're going into cardiac arrest." I was 26. I wanted my life. And I didn't want my life just for me, but I wanted it for my family. I'm thankful to still be here, and I'm thankful for that device that saved me.
Right, great. I would love to have a discussion about the video, but because of the lack of time, I'm going to quickly move into the next part. But the particular video about the Apple Watch, right? It is very nuanced, like the way they have modeled this ad, right? It's based out of true personal stories that were told by their customers, and they have reenacted it and they have shared it, right? Why I find it is very fascinating is like there is not a single mention about how a certain technology works, right? Or like it might have been part of the narrative, but they do not really they do not really go into in-depth detail about, okay, but their screen sizes or that or this, right? But it tells about the story of 3 individuals. And it again brings back to the factor about empathy, right? If you or I are struggling with a certain physical limitation, right? It also helps us understand, okay, we have been in their place. And so effortlessly, it focuses right on people, and they use the story of the people to sell their technology, right? And I think it is a brilliant like way Apple has been using. Like if you look at their Apple Watch ads, right throughout, it has always been about how it is a health device first and how it helps saving lives. Why do I draw inspiration from that is because now we can see the shift that is happening. Even the brands, they want to use the power of storytelling to sell their products. And when we work with the communities, right, and being activists or being young peace builders, being people who are passionate about different causes, right, we are right at the center of the community in our work. And how do we put their stories first? But also in the meantime, how do we put their stories first while giving them the agency, while help them to tell the story in their own way? And also with consent and with right ethics, as earlier told by Sharanya, right? So for me, storytelling, like, okay, if somebody asks me, okay, break it down what storytelling really is, right? It is a simple process of like communicating an idea or an emotion or an information to the audience, right? It is that simple process. I know it might look very unnuanced, but it is the simple aspect of communicating a message, communicating an emotion, communicating an idea, communicating a narrative to the audience, right? So I'm just quickly going to dive into, I would love to ask you, like if I may ask you, what are some of the tools of storytelling? I'm not going to go into the Mentimeter because of the lack of time, but I would love to hear from you, like, if you could put it in your chat box, like, what are some of the tools you use in your storytelling, right? And if in order to break it down a little bit more, what are the tools, right? Tool, grade 8 science, right? A tool is something that makes our life easy, right? If you watch the 3 Idiots movie, right? Zip is a tool, right? Pen is a tool, right? Pulley is a tool, right? So what are some of the tools we use in our everyday lives to tell stories? I can give one person opportunity to quickly unmute and say, like, what is the one tool? But I want you to, like, to be a little bit mindful of the time and make it quick. Yes, Samita has said it can be a picture or photo, like, yes, absolutely. Anybody who wants to quickly unmute and say? Blogs, Instagram. Yeah, we are talking also about platforms, but I'll come back to it. Anybody? Using examples, right? Right, brilliant, right? Tools are something that is going to help us communicate a story in an easy way, right? For example, I have this option of just sitting here and just talking to you in Zoom, right? In 10 minutes, you would be bored. Okay, what the hell he is talking about, right? What are the different tools I'm using? I'm trying to use a presentation. I'm trying to use pictures. I'm trying to use a video. I'm trying to use the tonal differences to communicate a message. I'm trying to engage you. These are different tools I'm trying to use to stay relevant right throughout this time, right? In a similar fashion, what are some of the tools we use to communicate our messages, right? It could be pictures, it could be photographs, it could be videos, right? It could be memes, right? As Sharanya told, it could be theater, right? It could be written pieces, it could be poem, right? It could be music. So these are some of the compelling, powerful tools we could use in our everyday lives to communicate the stories we want to communicate, right? So, like, these are some of the examples, right? I'm not going to dive too much into it, but I'll just quickly reflect on this picture and go, like, in the old days of traditional media, right? The communication has only been one way, right? Television brought us the news. We received it. Newspapers brought us the news, right? We received it. It has mostly been one way. If it is two-way, it was like a letter to the editor or something, right? But right now, in the new paradigm of storytelling, the one-way communication, now it has been democratized, right? Each and every single one of us can tell the story, right? Each and every single one of us can produce a content and share it in the meantime with larger audience, right? If we consider our parents or grandparental generation, right? They didn't have much opportunity to tell the world what they really wanted to tell. But if you're part of the social media generation, if you own a smartphone, if you're connected online, right? You have a unique opportunity to go and say what your story should be, right? Say Instagram. Now you can post a picture with a caption. Now you can post it reel with moving images, right? Now Instagram is like right, left, and center promoting moving images in the forms of reels, right? Or you can promote even like a design, like a what do I mean by design? A poster and promote a message. Say Facebook. In like how many of you, I don't know how many of you are like familiar with this dish called sambar, right? Sambar is a mixture of all the vegetables or most of the vegetables combined, right? So sambar of everything. You can do live video, you can do photography, you can do so much when it comes to Facebook, right? Say TikTok. right? It's one of the fastest growing social media, and it is one of the social medias where you can have the highest form of organic reach, right? With moving images, and the possibilities are so much endless. And now you have a platform, the information sharing is democratized, and you could share your stories far widely, right? And I'm just quickly going to move into the case study of why storytelling, right? And I specifically want to focus your attention into one tool, right? Which is photography, and the right side of photography, which is caption writing, in telling the everyday stories that we come across. But before going into anything, I want to come back to all of you and ask you a question, right? What does successful storytelling mean to you? When do you think, we told that storytelling is a process, right? When do you think the act of a storytelling becomes successful? Can I ask one person to unmute and say, nothing else, just simply in your own point of view, when do you think a storytelling becomes successful?
Yeah, I think personally for me, when a story is thought-provoking and made me look into another new perspective, that story for me would be like a successful story.
Right, yes, when it is thought-provoking, when it makes you look into a different perspective, very good. And Nabila insisted when it comes to when it changes your point of view, great. I can give one more person a chance. Does anybody want to say?
When it makes a person to make a move, go act.
Okay. Right, when it is being, yes, when it makes a person to act, right? Or when it's being shared or narrated by others, right? And all of you are right, right? If I could sum all of this up and say, right, when it resonates with the individual or your audience, right? I told you, right? Storytelling is the process of a storyteller communicating a message or an idea or an emotion with the audience, right? And then a storytelling becomes successful is when the storyteller manages, when it makes the impact, the story, when the impact is made on the audience, which was originally expected by the storyteller, right? It could be the simple way of saying, okay, that is when a storytelling becomes successful. And when somebody goes and retells the story you tell, or when it changes your point of view, or when it is shared or narrated by someone else, all these are the result that the particular story the storyteller has shared has made an impact in you. And because it made such a profound impact on you, you want to go and share that story with others, right? We can just relate it in our day-to-day experience, right? We would have come across this incredible story that we cannot wait to go and share with someone who is my best friend, or who is our partner, or who is someone we have the rapport with, because it is so good, right? And we do this all the time. When we watch a really good TikTok, we share it with somebody whom we think would want to look at that story. When we look at Instagram posts, right? Or when we look at in Facebook, right? We immediately share it because we want more people to look at it. And the storytelling becomes successful because it manages to make that impact on the audience, right? I would invite you to go home and do this, right? Write a list of some of the stories, like it could be songs, it could be movies, it could be photographs. Write a list of some of your favorites and ask, what is the impact it makes on me?
Sir, can I say something?
Yes, if you could make it really quick, I would appreciate it.
Okay,
Yes,
okay, sir, I got it. Sir, the main point is when the storyteller is experienced and expertise, mean an intellectual person, and the story, if the story is accurate, truthful, and actually it is optimistic. So it will have far optimistic consequences on the audience.
Sure. Great. So I'm going to thank you so much for that. So I'm going to quickly move into the presentation as we are looking at how it can be successful, right? So I want you to introduce, I'm not going to spend too much time into it. We can do a really good activity, but we don't have enough time. So in the interest of time, I'm going to introduce you to something called Everyday Africa. I would encourage all of you, those who use Instagram or even Facebook, to go and check out this page, Everyday Africa, right? And what does this storytelling movement succeed, right? What is their form of storytelling is very simple, right? What do they do is, it is a collective of photographers from all over Africa. And their form of storytelling is, they post a picture, right? And they ask you to post a picture with a hashtag called Everyday Africa, right? What is the tool they use? They use two tools primarily. One is a photograph, and the second one is a caption, right? The right side, right? Like the writing of a caption that is telling, okay, what does this picture represent, right? So I would encourage you to go and check this particular Instagram page called Everyday Africa. What does this entail is how it came to be, right? So there were these two photojournalists and a journalist named Peter DeCampo and Austin Merrill accordingly. They went to Africa. They stayed at one of the Sierra Leone, I think the country was, not Sierra Leone, I'm sorry. I cannot immediately remember the name of the country. They stayed there. The country was affected by both epidemic as well as the war, like a civil conflict there. So they went there, they were working there for a couple of weeks. They went back to US. And this particular photographer found that the pictures he made from his DSLR camera and the pictures he made from his smartphone, right? The narratives they convey are two completely different narratives, right? What does they mean, right? What does it mean, right? It means that although the smartphone managed to capture the everyday lived realities that are found on the region, the DSLR camera portrays the particular community he worked in a very negative light, like in a stereotypical Africa. So what they did was, after having questioned, they went back to the American high schoolers and they asked, okay, what are the 10 things that comes to your mind when you think about Africa, right? And to their surprise, almost all 10 things they told were stereotypically like negative stereotypes about Africa, right? And they realized how they have been helping to, as I told you earlier, right, normalize these narratives and stereotypes about Africa. So they said no media organization is going to agree with them to showcase the everyday realities, but we can use the power of social media to tell it, right? And we want the Africans to be right at the center of telling these stories, right? We do not want anybody else to tell these stories. Let's help them to tell their stories. Let's give the agency to them. So they have started this movement called Everyday Africa, right? Simply they take pictures, they write caption and tell what everyday life in Africa looks like, right? And it has really caught on fire. And if you see, there's over 500,000 hashtags with Everyday Africa, where people come out and say, this is my everyday reality looks like, right? And these are some of the examples, right? For example, here you can say what's happening in a slum in one of the countries in Africa, right? There is a picture, right? And there is a caption, right? These are the things we often do not see in the mainstream media, right? But the social media gives an incredible platform because now all of us have a smartphone, right? All of us can take a picture, all of us can take a video, and all of us can write a caption and post this. And wow, now almost it reaches 500,000 people, right? Simple photographs with caption, which showcases the everyday stories, right? And they have, because of the success of it, they expanded it, right? So many countries have started doing it, and they've made it the everyday projects. And if you go through it, you can see there's everyday Afghanistan, everyday Africa, everyday Amazon, everyday climate change, everyday Sri Lanka, everyday India, and so many more of these similar models, right? Where they come and say, okay, these are our stories, right? So in the digital storytelling initiative we do, I teach, like we do this everyday storytelling case study, right? After having been inspired by this, right? These are some of the storytelling movements that were founded by some of the alumni. Which one is Everyday Mullaitiv, right? Mullaitiv is the district that was highestly affected by war. But he said, okay, we don't want to be always remembered as a post-war region, but we would also want to say the stories of resilience that comes out of Mullaitiv, told by those who are from Mullaitiv, or those who go and experience Mullaitiv in the first hand. This thing is, if you go to Mullaitiv, you can share your story with a photo and a caption, with a hashtag called Everyday Mullaitiv, and you can get featured, right? Everyday Kathankudi. Kathankudi is this place where after the Easter Sunday attacks, a lot of people tend to remember it as the safe haven for terrorists, but it is much more than that, right? It's a stereotypical image. So one of the students said, a female Muslim student from there said, I want to redefine how Kathankudi is looked at, right? The lens through which the Kathankudi is looked at. Similarly, Everyday Betiklo, Jaffnapedia, right? These are some of the areas in Jaffna that tells the stories, the first-hand stories where storytellers are reclaiming the narrative and giving their first-hand perspective about how they want to be remembered, right? Because of the lack of time, I'm going to quickly make it, right? We can easily take a picture and share a story. Like for us, it could be a bunch of cows in the seashore. But the moment we incorporate it with a caption, right? For example, freely roaming cattle are a common sight at Cox's Bazar and throughout Bangladesh. These cows may have been attracted and discarded, attracted to discarded food, or perhaps like the human around them, they appreciate cooler air near the water and beaches of sand. And you can also see how a caption can really set a context into an image that might not mean anything when it stands alone as an image, right? So I would really want you to go capture some of the images and also to explore writing captions, because caption gives you an ability to set the context where it is happening. What is the problem people in this frame are facing? And also to build that emotional connection we have been talking about, right? So the interest of time, I'm quickly going to stop here. And I'm going to open the floor for questions. Rukshana, if we have more time, we can take few questions for both Sharanya and I. But one of the things I would want to encourage you when you go back today from here is, how do we use this tool, right, of smartphone, the camera it has? How do we use it to tell the stories of our communities, right, of our lived realities? And how do we use like, you don't have to write a 300-word caption, right? It could be even 20, 30 words. But how do we set the context in which certain things are happening? And how do we really get the communities, how do we educate to those who would otherwise have a stereotypical image of where we come from usually, right? So with that, I'll quickly end my session. And Renushi, over to you.
Yeah, hi. I'm not sure if someone else had questions, so I'll keep mine very brief. So it's more of like an observation, but you can maybe comment on it if you wish and if there's time. But something that I have, something that's been coming up, I think very frequently in the discourse, and personally where I have been traveling as well, is the connection between public spaces, storytelling, and advocacy. And I feel like there's a very interesting conversation there as well, you know, especially with the Aragalaya and the protests that have been happening in Sri Lanka, for example. We always knew, like, you know, places like the Galle Face or the other places where, you know, there's been a lot of protests happening. We always knew they were public spaces, but we never, I don't know, for some reason, we never saw it as our own. And the fact that the public were able to reclaim it, and I think there was a very strong sense of storytelling going on there as well to convey some very powerful messages, especially when you look at it from an advocacy lens, to communicate to policymakers and decision makers about the real stories, the lived realities that so many people go through. And I've also been thinking about, you know, places like museums, for example, or places where people from different walks of life and different who hold different ideologies and perspectives, how we can leverage public places to convey a message as well. And I just want to share a very briefly experience I had to some of the museums. I'm in the US right now, and some of the museums I've been to, it's very non-conventional in a sense. Sometimes when we look at places like museums or makeshift temporary sites that keep propping up, it's usually just a walking path where you are told what to think. But here in most other countries, I've seen kind of prompts or questions that encourage us to reflect and have and kind of come up with our own answers instead of you know, telling people what to think. And those are usually conveyed through stories, and then people are encouraged, the public who view these exhibits or whatever, are encouraged to think on their own and reflect on how they want to interpret things. So I just wanted to share that, you know, the connection between how can we leverage public spaces that we often forget are ours to use for advocacy and for storytelling. So just wanted to share that. Thank you.
I mean, I think that's a really good point that Renushi raised, but I want to say just one thing that we also have to remember is that stories can evolve, right? So something I found very interesting in the US also is that it had been 5 years since my last visit. And when I first went, I was very consciously aware of the lack of Indigenous people's narratives in museums. For example, in the Natural History Museum in New York, which is probably one of the largest in the world, the dioramas that depict the meeting of the Indigenous people and colonizers completely erase the violence that colonizers have perpetrated on Indigenous folks. But now, because of the awareness and the fight that Indigenous activists have campaigned for years, there are now sort of plaques that are attached that says, hey, let's rethink this. Like, this is what it is, what we had put here before, but this is a problematic viewpoint. And I think that's a really important element also to remember with storytelling, is that in South Asia, we have a tendency to also look at the Western world as almost foolproof in some ways, because of the way their spaces are designed, right? A good question to also always ask ourselves is, whose stories are missing from these spaces? And how do we find ways to include them within? And I think that's a really important question that we also have to teach ourselves and our systems to ask when we take things at face value. I think you made a really, really important point about encouraging a thought process. And even the stories we tell, how do we question them? And how do we encourage others to question the stories we tell as well? I think that's really important in what you raised. There's a
Rukshana,
fantastic question in the chat, which I think Benny should take on, about a story when it's too controversial. Just because I'm curious as to hear Benislos's reflection on that selfish.
Thank you for that question. This is something, okay, like one of the examples I shared, right? It's about the everyday storytelling movement, right? Then you end up photographing, like when you want to showcase how your realities look like, right? Where the community are coming from. You are going to photograph public spaces, and also eventually you're going to find, like, there are people who are going to be part of your framing, right? Who are going to be in your composition. And that there's always this question of, do I have to ask consent, right? Where do I draw the line, right? If I'm taking somebody else's picture on the street, where do I draw the line, right? Do I ask everybody, right? Or then sometimes it's also like a dilemma the photographers have, right? Sometimes you want to catch someone in like when they're off guard, in a way, not off guard in the sense of like when they're in their natural self, right? So why I want to connect the question is, how do we tell very controversial stories also because when it's too controversial, also because these are some of the questions that a storyteller will definitely encounter when you start producing stories, whether it's like photographs. Like photography is one of my favorite tools of storytelling, so I will stick to photographs, right? And a lot of students tend to come and ask me, okay, where do you draw the line, right? For me, and Sharanya also reflected on the aspect of greater good, like, okay, in whose perspective it is greater good, right? Does it give agency for the one on the frame? Is it greater good for them as well, right? So, is it worth taking away the agency or the consent from, right? So these are some of the struggles I have. So even with street photography, when people ask, where do you draw the line when you capture a subject? I always go to the framing about, okay, what is the narrative I'm trying to communicate? And is the narrative in a way empowering whoever I showcase in the frame, right? And I don't want to use the word empowering in a loose sense where I feel it is empowering, while it wouldn't be empowering for somebody else. Like, for example, right, one thing I could tell you, like for me, like in the Tamil term, like in the language I speak Tamil, the use of the word survivor, right? It translates to Tapiplaitam, right? But I would never want to be associated with the word because it is so disempowering to associate myself with that word, right? So when somebody might have the thought of, okay, I'm empowering them by using that word, but as a subject, I wouldn't want to do anything with that word, right? So these are some of the hard questions, but I also like try to understand this a little bit. I consider myself a student of storytelling, so I try to expand my horizon by talking to my people and try to understand what, like whether it is okay for them to be captured in a certain light, and also what I consider myself as like my simple line, if I could very simplify it, is okay. At least in my thinking, hopefully it's not delusional. Am I telling a positive story? And I don't do one brand of storytelling, which is romanticizing poverty or romanticizing somebody else's inability. I don't want to do that. That is why I drew a clear line and say, it is not worth for me to showcase someone in a negative, like it's not worth to romanticize their suffering just because it makes a powerful story, right? If at all I'm doing that, is it done with the agency, and is it done in a way that it empowers them? And how do we tell controversial stories? There's no secret sauce to it, right? It differs from, I have so much of huge admiration for those who tell controversial stories and those who have the say, okay, this is going to bring a lot of hate to me, but I'm still going to tell it, right? I could give just one quick example and just give the floor to Sharanya. There was a movie called Demons in Paradise that came out in Sri Lanka, right? That movie got so much of backlash from the very community it focuses on. But then I have so much of admiration for the filmmaker because he told, okay, this is the story I want to tell. I know you're going to hate me for the rest of my life, but I'm okay with it. Because I believe in the convictions of my values and I want to tell this story, right? So it differs, and I don't want to prescribe this is the way to go about it, but I would really want to ask you the question of why do you want to tell you this story? To whom do you want to tell this story to? And what is the end goal of your storytelling? Right? Is it to really advance your agenda, or is it to really put those who are in your frame right at the center and to empower them in an honest fashion? So that's about, I'm sorry for that long thing, but that's what I think, Sharon.
Thanks, Benny. I don't really think anything is there to add apart from the fact that I think when you're telling a controversial story, I mean, I do work with sex workers, and on sexual violence. And sometimes those are very controversial stories you have to bring out. But I think the question you also ask yourself is, why are you telling this story? And what is it about this story you think will compel? What is it? Why are you telling the story, really, right? What is the purpose of telling the story? Because sometimes we tell controversial stories, I notice, in the development sector for the sake of controversy. And that is also disempowering to the people whose stories you are telling. I think the question we have to ask ourselves is, this is a controversial story. Why is it controversial? And what is the reason we feel it is important to put that story out there? Because I think if that is at the core, the why is at the core of the storytelling process, then it's really important to center that. I just quickly want to answer Said's question, which is about the ratio, how you bring it up. I mean, this is a huge question, right? And that's like a month-long workshop of its own to kind of talk about this particular subject. But just to quickly touch in terms of the topic of this session, which is storytelling for advocacy, I think a big part of how you can work towards that is to tell these compelling stories of the girls themselves, of these girls in this district who want an education. What is preventing them from getting an education? And use those tools of simple language, use the tools of having empathy at the core, and a call to action. If you're able to do that, then very much you can move the needle forward in getting people on board and driving the change, because the change is going to take a long time, but the stories will help engage people to bring forward that change. I think we're really at time, so I'm going to hand back to Rukshana to wrap us up.
Thank you, Sharanya, and thank you, Beni. You know, a lot of us who joined the session have stayed for nearly 2 hours now, and I think they've thoroughly enjoyed. I'm getting a lot of requests on the chat box for the recording as well of the session. So the feedback that I'm getting is very positive, and thank you so much, Sharanya and Beni, for enriching this advocacy space and for bringing your story to this, you know, and to also being so openly, you know, talking so openly about what works, what doesn't. And I hope everyone's taken away something from this session. Thank you to everyone who stayed with us. If there's anything else that you want us to cover, please feel free to reach out to us. And I think that's it for the day. So thank you all.